Okay, this is a double header for me. Today I interviewed James Pogue and I interviewed a journalist, Jimmy Tobias. But today I am here with Wally Chamberlain, also known as Anarchocontrarian on Twitter, a man of many pseudonyms. Um, he was big in early in Doomer Optimism. I think your first time you were on was at episode 5.
Yep.
Was Pat and Jason?
Pat and Trace.
Oh, and Trace, nice. Okay, yeah. And then since then you've been on interviewing different kind of important figures early on
Yeah,
in
some
the
awesome
podcast.
ideas.
Ben Falk and Chuck Marone, Ben Hunt, Chris Arnady, all like very I would say, kind of big names, at least in our world. And so Wally and I were just recently I've made mention of it on the podcast before, this event I hosted with Gord McGill and Pat, my husband, and Wally also helped us a ton in Margaretville, New York, which was basically an event where Paul Kingsnorth happened to be in the East Coast of the United States. He had a weekend free, and he had always wanted to meet and have a conversation with philosopher, craftsman, mechanic type guy, Matt Crawford. And I've been a fan of Matt Crawford since like high school, no, college, when he wrote Shop Class's Soulcraft, and which was kind of like our generation's version of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Hmm.
Um, and so Paul Kingsnorth asked me if I could get Matt Crawford, to an event similar to the ones we had at the Wagon Box. I said, yes, I'll try. Matt Crawford said yes, and we had this amazing event together. And at that event, Wally had a session with Andy Hickman, basically about this tension of like home, staying and going. And Andy's been in this like totally crazy arc of like, move anywhere or travel at all times or like completely stay put at home, kind of like oscillating between those two extremes. And Wally's always been a kind of like stay home, the virtues of home, the virtues of place and belonging type of guy. And he wrote this poem, Should I Stay or Should I Go? No, sorry, Ways You Can Stay, at that was published where it was published in Front Porch Republic and also.
Yeah, and Homesteaders of America magazine.
That's right. And that was like kind of an early Doomer Optimism like
Yeah, yeah,
group project where you were like you tweeted the poem or you tweeted about the idea of it, and then we like encouraged you to write it, and then Neil Clark illustrated it, and it was like this
yeah. It was
cool like
awesome. You guys
super
are, yeah,
fun
big inspiration.
collaborative project, and everybody who reads it loves it. That whole session with Andy at the Margaretville event was so cool. I'm sorry this is such a long intro, but it's kind of important, and I'll like ask you to get your take on this too. But during that event, so like I've known Wally, through these years, and I met him a couple of different times now, and it's we get along super well. But during this event, there was kind of an unintentional undercurrent that the solutions to all of our problems were in some sort of religious path or like a religiously based society. And while I think religion is important and have started to go bring my kids to church because I think it's important to like part of belonging, and important to understand the whole culture behind it, and there's also a whole bunch of like moral questions that you can wrestle with in that place. I was also thinking the whole time, and something we didn't like talk about at the event, that there are secular ways to think about solving some of these problems too, and we didn't really talk about that at that event at all.
Yeah, sure.
And we talked about it since. And so the point of this podcast is to talk about these more secular ways of thinking about like just I guess scale and politics and civics is the best way to put it.
Yeah,
I
totally.
think a lot of times in this last conversation, it was like, is Catholicism the right path? Is Orthodoxy the right, is Protestantism like, and it just feels like a lot of schisms and these other ways of thinking about politics that we're going to talk about today are, more plural, more tolerant, and like sort of, built around neighborliness, I guess. So with that, I'll just have you maybe say your anything I missed from the introduction, and maybe anything you want to add about why we're here and what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great job. The only thing I would add is like, so many people came up to me after my talk, which again, or my talk with Andy, which again was, should I stay or should I go? And I was obviously advocating for the importance of, basically a multi-generational commitment to place. And there were a lot of folks in the room who did not have that, or did not grow up in the way that I did, which was multi-generational in place. And they were like, how do I get this thing? Like, how do I get community? How do I know when to settle down somewhere? How do I engage? And I think these things are related, right? We can engage with our community in a civic sense and an economic sense. I mean, I think we can talk a little bit about both of those things, but by diving in and seizing, in some instances, more agency locally. And yeah, but other than that, you did a great job. I guess again, maybe the only other thing is like there was a very like old church versus like new old church element at play, but definitely like a lot of Orthodox Christians and Catholics. And I think a lot of the things that we'll talk about today are sort of like the secular versions of Catholic ideas, like distributism and subsidiarity. Basically, distributism being an economic theory, and subsidiarity being largely a civic theory. And I think there are secular versions of that. So we can dive deeper in, but that's I think a quick overview.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I think one thing I'll just highlight again is I think a big thrust of the conversation in Margaretville was sort of a moral framework, like, religion as a moral framework of social cohesion and togetherness and like shared purpose. But there are also, you just said, political and economic, and maybe even you could say like environmental when you think about place-based things that hang people together, that have a shared purpose. And so that's basically what we're going to talk about today, because I do get a little bit like hesitant, like I live in a neighborhood that has tons of different, in Chicago, tons of different religions, tons of different ethnicities. And if I'm like only kind of seeking a future where I only associate with Catholics, that doesn't sound great to me. Like that's not really what America's supposed to be about anyways. It's
Sure.
supposed to, there's it's cool that there's freedom of religion. It's cool that there's this pretty robust Catholic community still exists in my area. That's super great. I love that. But that's just not the whole story. So anyways, that's what we're going to talk about today. And then maybe we could get to this to start framing it a little bit in light of the election. Because I think if we start to think about, just the scale of politics that everybody talks about is federal, and it turns, into kind of like team sports, like melodrama. And it does feel a little bit like, even now, I mean, obviously it's normal to feel like this now, but in between the election and the inauguration, there's this like dramatic revealing of cabinet appointees, and everyone's following like the sports pages, and to some and sort of reading the tea leaves, like what's going to happen with this. And it does feel in some ways like, drama or reality TV, and it does sort of take away our agency. So I don't know, maybe we could talk a little bit about, just to start, this like scale of how people normally think about politics.
Yeah, I think, not to go back again to the event, but so much of what we talked about was, basically the machine, right? The Leviathan operates at such a scale that like we find ourselves not being able to relate to it really in any meaningful way. And therefore we have no sense of a feeling of agency, right? So like at the scale of federal politics, like my vote literally makes zero difference, right? Zero. At the scale of the global Walmart economy, like my dollar basically makes zero difference. And I think that these things are related, right? And when we involve ourselves in the economy, we involve ourselves in civics, like by proxy, right? Like through three or four or five or six or seven different proxies, like it becomes gamified or sportified, right? And I think we found ourselves at the retreat, like all wanting to regain a sense of agency. And, I think we also found out that the answers for what we seek are not at the scale that everybody thinks it should be, right? So the answers are locally. And so, again, the question is like, what would a more human scaled civics or a more human scaled economy, what would that look like? What might that look like?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and I've called those things like an arm's length engagement. Like right now, all of our engagement, like I said, in civics and in the economy is by proxy 5, 6, 7 times removed. Like we need to bring all of that back within arm's length and think about the things that we can engage with locally, right? And so, really,
Yep.
what we're talking about is like localism on the economic front and on the civics front.
Yep. And
And
local and like those specific ways in which you can think about or models or theorists who have thought about different approaches to localism. So disclaimer, there's a lot of isms in this episode. And
yeah, so like,
anyone like Wally who knows, I genuinely do not know anyone who knows all of these isms as well as you do. And it's just so funny because you've done a really good job. You bring in some like super far left and super far right thinkers on this topic of civic at a like a local scale, civics at a local scale, which is super interesting because very few people synthesize these things in the way that you do. And I don't think we've ever talked as explicitly about these things on the podcast. So it's going to be
probably
super
not.
fun.
Yeah, yeah.
Just like totally nerding out. And then I just want to remind myself that at the end, I want to bring back up there was such a robust conversation after your session with Andy, and people were asking all sorts of questions. And I want to like remind myself what people were asking about. I think they were asking like how to stay or where to go if they don't have a place to belong.
Mhm.
So let's bring that back up because I had to cut the conversation short to not cut into the next session, which was also really amazing. Jeff Schaefer's talk and Travis Logan's.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, there was just like a desire to talk about this. So I want to just remind us to bring that back up at the end. But okay, so I'll like release you. I'll free
Sure,
you to start going on these isms and like
sure,
naming them and maybe defining.
sure. I mean, you built me up probably way too much. I read like four books, so that's that is the extent of my expertise. I don't want to misrepresent myself, but I do. I find these ideas interesting, and so I'll talk a little bit about the theory side of it. But then, I want to talk about practical applications or versions of these things I'm about to talk about, which are very close to me because they're related to how I grew up in New Hampshire. So I started talking. If we can frame things in terms of economics and civics, right? Two different categories. And so again, we have a Catholic version, and I want to propose, a secular version. So on the economic front, and I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time there, but let's just put it out of the way. So on the economic front, there's the principle of distributism in Catholic teaching. And distributism, the distributists, Chesterton, Belloc, you can look these people up, and I'll butcher it, but I'll give a synopsis. In essence, it was a response to socialism, and rather than communal ownership of the means of production, it was essentially widely distributed private ownership of the means of production. So rather than publicly owned industries, you have basically a series of smallholders, locally owned industries. So productive, private, property widely distributed.
And the
And
unit of ownership is the family, more or less, or like,
sure,
the whole,
yep,
like the, family business, family farm, family whatever, as opposed to like the state, then
correct.
that where we kind of like buy into a communal ownership structure and have to follow those, but instead it's like, smaller units of measurement, but the ownership structure is around the family. And I remember there was
Correct.
a point at which I was having a conversation with Chris Smage about this, and we were talking about distributism with a couple of Catholic scholars, and he said something like, it's a little bit divisive to say the family is the unit. And I'm
Mm,
like, well, it shouldn't be, it just really shouldn't be. And there's like a left leaning critique of like just thinking about like family at all as the unit, as being problematic somehow. I don't really get that. I do think like maybe just saying kin networks is maybe more
yeah,
inclusive or whatever, but it's just
yeah, I
totally
think
different than the state.
absolutely. I think the biggest thing is like at the smallest scale possible, right? And so there is a secular version. I think I'm proposing it as a secular version to distributism, and that is another ism called libertarian mutualism, which is really a theory that was proposed by Murray Bookchin. Murray Bookchin was a left libertarian anarchist Vermonter, so a good old New England guy. And he has many books, The Ecology of Freedom, um, Remaking Society, that you all can look into. But it's essentially the exact same thing: small scale, non-state regulated means of ownership of the means of production. Now, I think the difference between distributism and libertarian mutualism is there's a lot more that leaves room for collective ownership. It leaves room for the commons.
Mm.
It leaves a lot of room for co-ops. So, quasi publicly held, but at a smaller scale, right? The organization rather than around the church, around the family. It certainly could be church or family, I would argue. But the organization of the economy goes more into the guilds and trade unions and collaboratives. There's some interesting concepts, which maybe we can get into later, of usufruct, which is a legal term in today's legalese, but is essentially the concept of being able to take profit from property that you do not own, and this theory specifically from the commons. Right, I could build a barn on 100 acres worth of common open property, and I can graze my cows, and that's perfectly fine, and I can even take profit from that, so long as I'm not degrading the value of that property. Right, so that's usufruct in a nutshell.
Mm.
There's concepts of threshold taxes and threshold regulations, right? If I fall below a certain a scale of production, maybe I don't pay taxes. Maybe I pay an
Mm.
extremely small tax rate. If I fall below a certain scale, maybe I don't have to have those onerous regulations that the USDA enforces, right? I mean, obviously, in a true libertarian mutualism, the USDA would not exist, right? But these concepts could be applied to some of our systems today. And
And
then, of
something
course,
would something like so we had something in Uruguay that was like this, and I'm wondering whether this would fit in. So in Uruguay we had a basically a guild of or a cooperative of agroecological producers who then would kind of self-regulate in the sense that you would get the certification each year, but that would be monitored by fellow agroecological producers, not some external government bureaucracy, but like an internal system. Would that be a kind of
yeah,
regulation structure that would
yeah.
fit?
Again, I'm not no scholar, and I don't want to
Yeah.
represent
No,
myself as
but
one.
yeah,
But
what
yeah, I
seems
think
to, yeah.
in layman's terms, that sounds about right. The other thing that comes to mind is the Burley tobacco program, right? That Wendell Berry talks a lot about, and price parity, basically the limitation of production to make sure that There isn't surpluses that drive down prices, right? These are some concepts that are, that's a cooperative, right? It is literally organized producers that regulate the production. So those are things that you can do. And the only other thing I want to say, mutual aid, right? It's libertarian mutualism. Mutual aid obviously is, a more left coded um, theory, but it really just means taking care of your neighbors and a non-monetary bartering sort of economy, right? What does my neighbor need? What can I do for them? Vice versa. Again, without involvement of the state, like band together as neighbors to provide for each other. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that like there is a secular version of distributism called libertarian mutualism. I think we can talk more about the civic side because I think that's more interesting, but just wanted to like highlight that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. I have a couple of clarifying questions. The first one
Sure.
is, I've I study cooperatives a little bit right now in this project that I'm in now, food cooperative or food related cooperatives in different places around the world. And I really like cooperatives in general. I just think that
Mm-hmm.
they're such a nice model. And they seem to be totally of the left. And I'm wondering whether or not you can think of any examples that's more like a conservative. The first thing that comes to mind for me is in Uruguay, and this is, yeah, this, I mean, it's hard to say what is left and right in Uruguay, but we had an agricultural cooperative in town that was basically like the farmers in town, but the farmers weren't only row crop farmers. There was a whole bunch of different farmers, and especially people who were ranchers. And so that cooperative had a grocery store, and it was basically like, conservative guys, who run it, and they want to make sure like our region was well fed from the products of that region, and it wasn't really left coded at all. But I'm just wondering if you is there something like that in your did you have agricultural cooperatives
No,
ever in
not.
your upbringing?
Um, Trying to think. I have some inkling of there being like a dairy, because I grew up on a dairy farm, of there being a dairy cooperative that we were involved in, but sadly, I don't recall the details of. I
Okay.
think the one that does come to mind is the Burley Tobacco Program. Again, people can read up on that. I don't know if I would call that like conservative per se, but I would call it like nonpartisan. Sort of.
Yeah.
I think I don't think the concept of a co-op like precludes
Any
conservatives from
yeah,
creating a co-op.
right.
Co-op just means like a collective corporation. Like
Yeah,
there's
right. I
there's
know. I mean, I
ESOPs,
can
right? In the same
right now
similar way,
I
there's an ESOP, right? You could have collectively owned, collective stakeholders of a company, and that's really what we're talking about
yes,
here.
yeah. I mean,
So
what is happening in my head right now is I am hearing Neil Clark, um, which, you know what, Neil, you don't get to live rent free. If you want to come on the podcast and state your case, he's going to be against, frou food that gets and that cooperatives end up selling co-ops, grocery stores, and that it's really for yuppies and blah blah blah, and like the real food. I mean, I could just see, at least in the case of his life, a lot of his local food is not passing through a store at all. It's
sure,
made by friends and they share it, and that's just very much in line with this kind of way of
sure,
thinking, not
sure.
passing through a store. um, Neil living rent free. Okay, so now let's talk about libertarian mutualism as this more governmental.
Yeah. So that was distributism versus libertarian mutualism. Now we have subsidiarity and libertarian municipalism. Not to make it
Oh yes, yep, yep.
more confusing, right? So subsidiarity, and maybe you can help me out here, but my basic understanding is, again, it's a sort of a Catholic social teaching concept of basically like decisions should be made by the people who are most impacted by them and by the smallest amount of people at the smallest scale possible, right?
Mm,
So high agency, local governance, local self determination, high sense of autonomy at the small scale, right? Um, And libertarian municipalism, again, another theory largely talked about by Murray Bookchin, is essentially the same thing. Again, a secular version. It focuses a lot on direct democracy, right? You hear the concept of citizen legislator, right? Direct democracy, right? Everybody has a voice. Everybody can propose changes. Everybody votes in the open generally, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But participatory democracy, right? So
Mm.
in this town, we will all vote on whatever thing impacts us at the town level.
Mm-hmm. Um,
Um,
This sounds good. And actually, this is something I wrote about a little bit and something that I think is informing the way I want to continue working with Doomer Optimism in the future. But I wrote about in this unheard piece called The Case for Left Conservatism. I never even, the New Statesman, which is like, I guess, the Nation version of that magazine in the United Kingdom, reached out to me, one of the editors, and asked, would you write this piece on left conservatism? I had never heard of left conservatism, so I did this like deep dive into what this, phrase or how it's been used. And basically it's like, Wendell Berry conservatism. It's like, focused on place, but mostly it's critical of overly scaled structures. So overly scaling all of our markets to international corporations and, global commerce, and overscaling our governance to state, national, or international governance, and instead to like focus on what I said in the piece, subsidiarity, which is answering political questions at the lowest possible scale that they could be answered at
Absolutely.
before assuming that you should scale up to,
Absolutely.
if
Yep.
you're talking about a watershed, there's going to be a water reclamation district that works across, different municipalities. That sort of, that's the scale at which you solve that problem. If you're talking about your local neighborhood or your local parish, that's the scale you're talking about. If it's a statewide initiative, you talk about the state. So just thinking about that first and foremost, like what is the lowest possible scale, is I think like just such a radical thing in this day and age. And so just flipping your brain around with politics and asking, can I solve this on a lower possible scale, is like a great first step in
Sure.
trying to think through these things.
100%. And right. And everybody has a voice and everybody has equal vote at that local level, right? But inevitably, that brings up the questions like, what happens when you have problems that are at a larger scale than the local level? And with libertarian municipalism, there's a high degree of what I guess I would call like confederalism. So nested governments, right? So you band together as a town, everybody has a voice, but some things need to go and coordinate with the next town over, with the
Mm-hmm.
county, with the state, if such a thing existed in this theoretical world, right? But inevitably we would elect delegates, right? And that's generally what happens. Like by open vote, we'd elect Ashley to be our representative for libertarian municipalism bill or whatever.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah.
and which sounds normal, right? But what's not normal in this theory is that you are recallable at any time. So you go to the county and you're arguing for our village's issue for whatever reason, and you did a terrible job. Everybody in the town, or a majority of the people in the town, think you do a terrible job. You're out. We
I love
elect
that.
another person immediately. So recallable delegates, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about that as like within our current system right now, like could you imagine um,
You get
if you
recalled
could
right
if
away.
you could recall senators and representatives immediately versus waiting for the next election?
Yeah.
Like think about how scared they would be, right? And
Yeah.
how much more interested they would be in answering to the people, right?
And engage, and how engaged the citizens would be. Like, I'm paying attention to
100%.
what you're doing because you could be out of there if I don't like it. As opposed to like,
Exactly.
all right, well, he's in for 4 years, so I'm gonna just kind of check out on, what he's really doing in there.
Sure. Yeah. So I think direct democracy, nested governments, and maximum representation, right? So again, the smallest nested intertwined bodies of civic governance, right? And I think because libertarian is in the name doesn't mean that there is no governance. It just means that there is no bureaucratic state that says you shall do these things, right?
But the
So
bodies, the regulatory bodies are appropriately scaled to the problems. You know,
exactly.
they're specific and focused on whatever problem you're trying to solve, as opposed to either no government or like total government overreach that doesn't really know anything about the local specifics.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Exactly.
Do you want to talk about libertarianism at all briefly, like that you liked it and then now
Oh,
are
just
like
like in my own thing.
just yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess in terms of like if I were to describe my political journey, I would say like never voted ever in my entire life, ever, period. Though I did have like a W04 sticker on my like college trunk freshman year or whatever. So I would say I certainly come from like a conservative-ish type background, but went heavy into libertarianism
Hmm.
right around Ron Paul. In fact, like Ron Paul is really the only like politician I've ever got real excited about, though I still didn't vote for him. But went through a libertarian phase, honestly, until I discovered, I guess I would say like Wendell Berry, and sort of started to realize that, yeah, like rampant individualism without some sort of control is not good.
Hmm.
And a lot of the libertarianism I saw at the time was that. So I sort of consider myself, I don't know, I mean, a localist, I guess, is the
Yeah,
best way of
right.
putting it. Like, I
This
just
is
don't want
you're
to engage in anything that's bigger than I have like direct control over, or
right.
sense of
Okay. So
agency or
this is
power over.
basically what we're talking about today is basically where you've landed in terms of what resonates with you.
Yeah,
These like the appropriately scaled
yeah,
civics and politics. Okay.
yeah. And the reason why I've never voted doesn't really have to do with ideology per se. It's just like I never felt like anybody has ever represented me enough for me to get excited enough to pull the
Mm,
lever for. I've never felt in a position to vote for somebody and make a difference. I have very little confidence that people at the federal level like actually represent me or frankly any of us.
yeah,
So
right.
I've never like deluded myself into thinking it was important to me. And then even at the local level, not to get too much into my story, but though I advocate for staying, like I don't live where I grew up, and frankly wish I had stayed. And so like I don't vote in my adult life because I don't feel like I'm from this place. I don't feel like I should have a say.
Yeah.
I don't feel represented by the people in government. So I just abstain. Basically, I'm a conscientious abstainer, I guess, on the voting
Yeah, that
side.
makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah,
then let's talk about the practical examples as a way to like really dig into how could these things or do they exist already in certain
sure.
places? And then yeah, let's just dig into these different examples.
Yeah, so I don't want to make any illusions that like real libertarian mutualism has ever been tried or whatever, whatever the real socialism has never been tried,
Yeah,
anyways.
yeah.
But I do think there are concepts that currently exist that are ish to what we've been talking about, right? And some people may not even know about it. In fact, I talked a lot about it at in Margaretville. Andy and I had the mini debate, which was what I can't remember, like 30 seconds each, staking out like a ridiculous position. And his position was like, you should move to upstate New York for ultimate freedom or something like that. And my position was you should move to New Hampshire because that's where I'm from.
Yeah.
And this sort of came up, and I threw out some stats that I'll talk about here. And people don't know, right? So two concepts that I think has a lot of crossover to what we've been talking about. So the New England town meeting model, which is a governmental model that is unique to New England, at least in the United States. And we can talk a little bit about that. And then the other is the state legislature in the state of New Hampshire, which is very unique globally, let alone in North America. And they both have the same theme, which is high levels of representation, high local autonomy, and loud local voices. I guess I would say lots of autonomy. So New England town meeting. Why don't you tell me what you think or what you know of New England town meeting?
I
Just to
so when I've only heard stories from like you and a few other people who have actually been to these things. But this Norman Rockwell picture of the
mm,
guy standing up, I don't know if that's in church or at a New England town meeting or what, but it's like basically you get in a room together and at some intervals and like discuss local issues and then like vote, I guess, or something like that.
yeah, nailed it. Yeah, so the
How
famous
many
like
people? So it's town. So
it's
however
towns. Yep.
many people are in the town, is there any obligation to go or is just open?
No obligation to go. So just quick rundown. I'll speak specific to New Hampshire because that's what I'm used to. I believe a lot of Vermont towns still use the town meeting model. Maybe some Massachusetts, maybe Maine. I frankly don't know, but let's assume that some New England towns still use the town meeting.
No, they're so backward and degenerated.
um, an important thing for other people in the United States that may not know, like there's no county power really in New England states whatsoever. Like you go into the
Interesting.
Midwest, there's lots of county
Yeah, Cook County is
governmental.
Chicago. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's none basically. So in New Hampshire, it's the town level and it's the state level. And the town meeting process is outlined in the state constitution. The town government, I'll talk about town government in essence. It's made up of the people who meet at town meeting, who are citizen legislators, and I'll talk about that in a second, and the select board. The select board is basically the administrators for the town government. They have very few powers. They have control over basically decision making on the emergency services side, police, fire, on the roads, which in New England is a big deal with weather. Roads are almost entirely locally controlled, very few state highways. Property tax assessment, right? In New Hampshire, there's no sales tax, there's no income tax. So towns get very little money from the state because the state gets very little money
Yep.
in revenues. And so property tax assessment is the biggest income stream. So they have power over that. And then enforcement of regulations, not making regulations, enforcement of regulations. So I'll summarize all that, but they are the administrators of the town government. They are not policymakers. Okay.
Okay.
Generally 3 members in the select board, sometimes 5 members in the select board, obviously always an odd number because any decisions that they make require a majority. And they basically make no money. And by that, I mean not like below the poverty level. I mean like no money, like at all.
Like it's
So
volunteer.
essentially, yeah, they're basically volunteer. In some places, they might get like a very small stipend, but it's negligible.
Okay.
So there's a select board, right? And that people might find that relatable, like a town council or a city council. But again, these people are not setting policy at all. They're not legislators. All legislation happens in one of 2 ways. A town committee, like the planning commission, different towns can have different committees, planning commission, zoning commission. They can propose legislation, or any citizen can propose legislation. Those are
Interesting.
two means to propose legislation for the town. And the process by doing that, let's say you're a citizen and you want to propose legislation that chicken coop should be illegal, right? Let's say
Yeah.
you want to be that woman, right?
Wouldn't be me, but
you would draft what they call a warrant article, which is basically the language of this regulation you're trying to impose. And then you need to get a certain amount of signatures by a petition of your fellow citizens in town. And once you do that, it can be presented at town meeting for vote. And I'll talk more about that in a second, but it's either that or a committee can draft some regulation and propose it at town meeting for vote.
got it.
Only 2 ways that regulations can be made. What did I not cover there? Okay, so let's say you did that. Series of new warrant articles are up for decision at town meeting. Town meeting is always, I think, second or third Tuesday in March. Um, Anybody is invited if you're a full-time resident.
Once a year.
Once a year, period.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm thinking like monthly.
No, once a year, period. Unless in the case of like special elections and stuff, but in general, town meeting is once a year,
This
period.
has got to get rowdy.
It's yeah, so we'll get there.
You're waiting all year to get your thing going. Yeah.
100%, 100%. So like I said, it's a Tuesday in March, which means you need to make space for it, right? Most people work on Tuesdays, which is a controversial thing. Like there's been lots of efforts trying to move it to Saturdays so more people can participate. I can see the pluses and minuses, but in any event,
Just take the day off.
yeah, people make time for it.
Yeah.
People make time for it. So um, you can only vote at town meeting if you're a resident, right? I've been to town meetings, listened. I can speak. I'm not a resident. I can ask to speak, and if people allow me to, I can, but I cannot vote. I cannot do a yay nay. And there's a function at town meeting called the town moderator. And this is interesting. It's another sort of public position. Again, not paid or very negligible pay. And they're basically preside over town meeting. Simple as that. They read the warrant articles. They
call on people.
Call on people to speak. They preside over the voting. They call the vote. Important fact is that they can be appealed at any time, right? So we get back to the recallable delegates, similar thing. If the body at town meeting thinks that the town moderator made a bad call, they can all vote then and there to rescind whatever decision was made there. But in essence, everybody at that meeting has equal vote. Everybody at that meeting can filibuster or can orate for or against the proposed measure. And all of the voting for the proposed regulation happens by yay or nay vote. In other words, it's public. I can see or hear what everybody around me is voting for or against. So very direct, very intimate participation and local governance.
There's got to cause some controversy seeing how people vote.
There is a lot of controversy, yeah, which is what makes it messy and fun.
It's like you're siding with the Smiths, like,
yeah.
Don't you remember that, like back in the day, you had a fence post that didn't get, fixed by them? Like, you should be on our side. Yeah.
So it's important. Again, we can talk about in theory what this could look like, but what it actually looks like in New Hampshire is, all these warrant articles, all these regulations basically come down to land use. What you're allowed to do on your property, essentially, right?
Yeah.
There's very little else within the town control other than budget for roads, budget for police and fire, budget for school, right? A school meeting, in fact, is the same format. It's a separate meeting, but same format to vote and approve on school budget spending.
Would there be any kind of like approval or denial of a proposed development or proposed building?
Yep, that could it all depends on
like say a CAFO wants to come in or something like that.
Yeah, so a lot of towns have what they call, in New Hampshire at least, a land use ordinance. And again, that's a document, that's a regulatory document that needed to have been proposed by the planning committee or local zoning, whatever they're referred to, or by a citizen to say, here's our rules about agricultural zoning, residential zoning, business districts. What are the requirements for businesses in town? Do they need to have a separate septic than the residents that they might be located at? Which, oh, by the way, is something that's going on in my hometown. So it's pretty much limited to how we think people should use their land within this town, which is good, I guess, right? So the story that I would tell, and I think I've told on this podcast in the past, is like back in the day, my grandfather, who came to this country from Europe in the 50s, loved this country, and he loved the town meeting model, and he loved to talk. And so he filibustered at a lot of town meetings. In fact, he was in a lot of the history books and other books that have been written about the town, quoting various quotes from his filibusters at town meeting. And one of them was like, I didn't leave Nazi-ridden Europe for this. And what the this was proposed land use ordinance in town.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't ever one at the time. And now here was a bunch of neighbors saying, you shall use your property this way.
Yeah.
And he basically said that's BS. Now, at the time, it was BS because this community was deeply entrenched, many generations in place. Like people knew what shitting where you eat looked like. Yeah, I talked
Yeah.
about this in Margaretville. Like people
Yeah.
knew what good land use was and bad
Yeah.
land use was. They didn't need a regulation that says thou shalt do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. It was
And
an
so
overreach for the
yeah,
culture
so
had
he
figured it out. Yeah.
exactly the culture was such that at least my grandfather, and ultimately was voted down, felt like they didn't need it. But now there's a lot of transiency and folks that have left and new folks in town, and
And not as
a
coherent of a
lot of
culture.
people don't know what good land use is, and people might want full-time trash services, or people might want to not allow their neighbors have a compost pile because they think it's smelly, or whatever the case may
Mm.
be. And so there is a need for lines in the sand, right? A written agreement for how these things are presided over. So I can see both sides of it.
Mm-hmm.
So where were we? So yays, nays, public vote. You can see how your neighbor votes. There's definitely arguments, but it's messy. And
I'm curious more like the your actual experience of these things. Um like I don't know, maybe you could describe it a little bit. Like does it go you go in there and does everybody leave like mad? During it, is everybody really impassioned? Are there, like just like because I feel like almost nobody has this experience. I did a caucus in Nevada for Obama back when I was an idiot. Um and I that was cool because you had to like stand in a corner of the room for whichever person you were voting for in the primary, and it was the closest I ever got to that kind of like direct experience where it was like public, and there were all these sorts of rules like um, people who are not from Nevada can't be like holding signs inside the caucus room once people are deciding. Like you can't campaign at that point. You can just like stand and observe, that kind of thing. So and there was like some contention, contentious, like, okay, which corner am I going to stand in? Am I going to stand in the, God, who was it? Kucinich, corner or whatever.
Name I haven't heard in a while.
Yeah. So anyways, yeah, like just like a little bit, what was the feeling of it?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's like a camaraderie to the sense of like,
Totally,
we're in this
right? So
together. We got to figure this out.
yeah. So the day always it starts early. I don't know what time it starts, but the day always starts, and again, in my experience in my town,
Yeah.
with the ladies auxiliary, which is basically all the old ladies and old wives of the volunteer fire department. They do all the cooking, and they make the coffee, and they buy donuts or make donuts or baked goods, and everybody like gets their coffee and donut or muffin or whatever, and they're shooting the breeze, and there's like a build up for like what's about to come, right? And people are sharing their opinions. People are, maybe already breaking out into their factions, so they can rally
Also,
around each other.
are people somewhat campaigning in the days leading up, or
Totally.
talking to one another, like, how are you
Yep.
going to vote? What are you thinking about this? Okay.
100%. Yeah. In fact,
Which kind of leads to a little bit of conviviality. Like I had a
for
conversation,
sure.
even this is a very simple version of this, but like I had some conversations with people who around me who I like and respect leading up to this um, election just in November, including my father-in-law, who's a longtime judge, and he knows like the local judge candidates, and so it's like, okay, what are these people for? So it's like an opportunity to talk about where people land when you normally don't talk politics that much with certain people.
Yeah. Or like, when was the last time you read a bill that was proposed by the U.S. Senate. Like never,
Yeah,
right?
right,
But
right.
everybody reads the warrant articles that are being proposed
Mm.
locally, right? So the first part of conviviality happens when somebody who wants to propose a new change has to get those whatever 50, 100, 200, whatever signatures for it to even get proposed at town meeting, right? So you're trying to build a coalition to get your neighbors to sign this piece of paper that says you shall allow chickens no matter if
Yeah,
you
so you're bringing
whatever.
it to something you care about to other people's attention.
Absolutely. And so that's the first building of momentum. And then the second building momentum is when the warrant articles get published themselves. So the town publishes a booklet that has all the proposed warrant articles to be voted on at town meeting in advance, like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it is in advance
Okay,
of
so
meeting.
that 2 3 week period, everyone's reading and
So like
talking.
everybody's got the book on their kitchen table that says like, here's what I'm going to vote on next
Yeah.
Tuesday or whatever. And then they're like, can you believe this bullshit? Like, talking with your neighbors, and that's what my grandfather did. Like, we all ate breakfast and lunch at the farm table, and 9 times out of 10 there would be like non-family people there. Like they would just stop in for coffee, and my grandfather would just be like,
Campaigning.
presiding, campaigning. Exactly. So there'd be a lot of excitement there when you get your warrant articles, and then the excitement really builds the day of, like with your coffee and donuts, like I said. um, there have been times in my memory where things have been very contentious, and I would say less so as of late in my own specific example, because most folks, frankly, like are the old folks. There's not a lot of young people who are like engaging, and I think that a lot of that is sad, but a lot of it's rubbed off because of like the federal politics. I think that's my theory. Like
Yeah, and I
people are so
wonder.
burnt out with like this crazy game of federal politics. They're like, why would I go and do more of that, roll up my sleeves and do more of that
So,
here at home and take
in
a
your
Tuesday off.
estimation, yes, in your estimation, I wonder what you think about this. Do you think that if it's slightly more contentious to the point of not being like actually burning bridges, that's actually better because it means people are engaged and they
100%.
care? Yeah.
100%.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. It keeps making me think of my favorite quote, which when I was on Twitter, I used to tweet about all the time, which is from um, the Vermont Papers, which is totally about the subject. Everybody listening to it who finds it interesting should read it. But the quote is something like, rural life breeds a patience in the human condition that's necessary for a fundamental democracy.
Mm.
So it's basically like you need to fundamental democracy requires patience, like with your fellow man, right, and allow them the benefit of a doubt, right, to discuss with them in good faith, to make a decision, and then to the extent you can, like let bygones be bygones and bury the hatchet. And that was the good
Okay.
thing
Yeah.
about like town meeting is like you hashed it out in town meeting, the decision was made, and then you don't do it again for a year. Like you go
Yeah.
back to your daily life, and
And the
if
decision
you
is made and you kind of accept it, and that is what
exactly,
it
yeah,
is.
yeah.
Okay, so we have to pause here for a second because I think this is kind of what we just are talking about right now is the crux of what you and I both felt, and maybe some other people who were attending Margaretville felt, which is I think part of the assumptions about a society built around churches, various different churches,
Hmm.
is that you share a moral code or a cultural code that can't really be exported. But we're now talking about the contention that a town can have a moral code, even if there's a Presbyterian, an Episcopalian, and a Catholic church in that town. And you can overcome those, what can sometimes be petty internecine differences between churches or church doctrine or like interpretation of church teaching, which is something that's always bothered me about, saying like, well, we have this universalism with churches. Well, not in America when we have a million different churches, and we have religious, tolerance. Um, we're now talking about what is kind of like a fundamentally American concept that that's still experimental and
Mm.
playing out in various ways in various parts of America, which is, um, we can actually develop a neighborliness that's built around place that forces a kind of moral cohesion when we're forced to work together on a certain appropriate scale. I don't know. I have no contention that this can exist forever or is necessarily universally successful. All I will say is that in a pluralistic society that has religious tolerance, that has all sorts of ethnicities, there's no turning that back.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we might as well consider this model as a way to have a kind of like, moral cohesion um, that doesn't necessarily rely on having to be the same religion. And I
Yeah.
just think it's a little fragile to think in America, I'm only going to associate with people who have my same religion. That's kind of really not the contention of America. Like the whole thing is that we're pluralistic and tolerant, and yet we can thrive and cohere and solve problems together. So I don't know if you
Yeah.
have any
Woof, that was a lot.
response. I was my little Tocqueville rant.
No, I think I just think there's
Oh,
more.
hold on. I'll say one more thing.
Sure,
The
sure.
Margaretville event was an example of this.
Mm.
It was an example of a kind of tolerance and self-determination of a few little handful of Americans who don't agree on a lot, who could instead find the time to spend a weekend together tolerantly hearing one another out. Not that we were working on anything specific and political, and this is where I think like the scale of a town or a watershed or a bioregion is where there's more cohesion because you care about a specific place and that can hang you together. But I just think there's like this American specific tradition of, you know, organizing at an appropriate scale and being tolerant and coming up with something together because
Yeah,
of that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think we need to all agree on spiritual morality in order to like make decisions about practical morality, right? Like, there's like which God you pray to, and then there's like how do you feel about keeping your property tidy or
Yeah,
untidy? You
or
know what I
like
mean?
who
Like,
has to mend the east and north
yeah,
fences, you
yeah.
know?
Like, we're talking about very practical, everyday things that I think don't require like a complete um coherence, community coherence at like a spiritual level. We're just talking about how shall you interface with your neighbor, like
Yeah. I like that. Part of what I like about this whole conversation is that it's so practically oriented. It's not utopian at all. It's really about how can we practically solve the problems of our day-to-day existence and self-governance, ideally in America, when this is the situation we're in. We're in a pluralistic society. It's not like super coherent culturally, ethnically, or religiously. So what do we do? What have we done in the past and what can we learn from that?
yeah. So here's the thing, right? So I don't think we need to like all be Christian in order to function at like the community scale.
Yeah.
But what we probably all need to do is like stick around and know each other. Like, we can't both not be all Christian and not all be from here or sticking around here and knowing each
Mm,
other and knowing our neighbors. Like,
that's a good
we
insight.
cannot do that. Those two things like don't
You
coincide,
have to
because
have
then
at
you
least
have
one of those things.
then you have
Yeah.
no spiritual alignment and no practical everyday
Yeah.
alignment. Like, I know what kind of person Ashley is. I know what kind of family they come from. I know that they mow their lawn like they should, or whatever the case.
Yeah.
They're not going to get their nose up in my business. Or I
Yeah.
know you as a person, regardless of how you vote at town meeting, and if I think that was bullshit or not. You're like a good person from a good family who
And I'm not going
makes
to
good
leave you in the
decisions.
dust. Like
Yeah,
I'm
but
going to be there for you if you need me
yeah,
for.
But if
Yeah.
I don't know you, I don't know what type of person you are, I don't know what type of family you're from, I don't know how you keep care of your stuff or not, then I see like your moral differences from me, from a spiritual standpoint, or your political differences from me, and like like that's all I see in you, or you're not a
Yes.
Christian,
God,
using this
that's such an
example,
important
or you're
insight.
a
Yep.
lib or whatever, and so those are the only two
Well,
things
you
you are, right?
dehumanize
Yeah,
people. If you share a moral center and you're like, oh, I know you're a fellow Catholic, so therefore I know you're on my same page of these things, then you don't have to like know them super deeply. But then if you don't share those things and you don't have a lot of interaction or a long-standing relationship, is such an important insight. You will dehumanize and kind of like make into a caricature other people. And then you're not really going to care. You're just going to have political differences. And this is the state we're in now with
yeah.
people, calling each other degenerates or whatever, for voting for the opposite team. Okay, so detour over. Let's go back to the.
No, that I think I hit everything on the town meeting side. Like, the only thing I think I missed is like you can make amendments on the fly, right? So these warrant articles get
Oh,
proposed, they get read
really?
by the town moderator. People can argue the case for or against. People can say, I think you should change the shall to may. Does anybody agree with me? You get seconded. You can do ayes and nays. Like, okay, change the words now, and we'll vote on it, right?
Oh my
Which is cool.
God.
That's really really cool, right?
That's exciting.
But again, just the thing I want to hammer home is like this concept of citizen legislator, right? These are not hired people making decisions on regulations. They are the people who will be affected by those regulations, right?
Yeah.
And all of the people at least have the right to.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the town meeting in a nutshell. I don't know if I had much else to say. I mean, each town is different, but it is a lot of fun. You mentioned like working for Barack Obama and being able to like be a fly on the wall in some of the legislative bodies. Like when we were kids, the school was right next to the meeting hall, and like it was a school field trip. Like you'd walk next door, and like all the kids would like file in front of like town meeting and sit down, on the floor or whatever, and listen to half an hour's worth of presidings at town
Cute.
meetings. And I remember being like, super proud of my grandfather. Who would be like going off on a rant or whatever. But that was like our introduction to civics. Like we were there, attending, watching, witnessing civics happening like in real time. So that was really inspiring, and that's how obviously all this stuff got ingrained in me in an early age. But yeah, so that's like a quasi practical example of quote unquote like libertarian mutualism that's actually happening today. This town meeting governmental model. I want to talk a little bit about the New Hampshire state legislature, which has some similarities. And then I think we can get into like the what threatens these idealistic models, which we kind of already just touched upon, but I think there's some more threads to pull on there. So the New Hampshire state legislature, right? State senators, state representatives. Um, it is the third largest representative body in the Western world, right? The third largest. So the US House of Representatives is number one, the UK House of Commons is number two, and the New Hampshire state
By total
legislature
number?
is the number three. Yes, yes,
That's
yes.
wild.
So there's
Okay.
400 state reps from 200 plus districts. And what that amounts to is you have one rep for every 3,300 residents.
Oh, wow.
And just to like put it in scale, like there's over 100 towns in New Hampshire that have way less residents than 3,300, right? So like basically, those towns have a town to representative ratio,
Oh,
which
cool.
is that nested, I get back to the concept of like nested governmental bodies, right? High amounts of representation at the state level. So it's the largest representation to population ratio in the US. And just to give you that's the 400 state reps. Just to give you an idea, Pennsylvania is number two at 200 total. So huge representative body. Here's the greatest part: $200 a year is what you make as a state rep in New Hampshire, right? So these are true citizen
So they all have
legislators. Like you're only
other
doing,
jobs.
they all have full time jobs. Like you're
Okay.
only doing this because you want to make a difference.
Yeah.
So uh, I don't want this to be like a plug for New Hampshire, but like you have these amazing, like,
Well,
amazing direct
this is
democracy
this
at
is
the
really
local
the whole
level.
reason this exists is because you want to win that debate with Andy and you want a
100%. Like
whole hour and
I'm
a
trying to
half.
beat up Andy right now. But just to be fair, like Andy's case, which was a good one, was like upstate New York is a good place if you want to like drop out, which it made a good case. Like
Yeah.
I think New Hampshire is a good place if you want to like engage at
Yeah,
arm's
right.
length because those models exist now.
Right.
Um, and that is like the town meeting model and the state rep model. Um, so so I talked about town meeting, talked about state reps. I want to talk about culture a little bit. Like, I guess I would call it New England culture, or specifically the New Hampshire culture that I think lends itself or has historically to these types of models. And, that is like the Ethan Allen quote, like the gods of the hills are different from the gods of the valleys, and you shall
Mm.
know it. People are ornery, they're stubborn, but they're also neighborly and interdependent. Like they rely
Yep.
on each other, they help on each other, they help each other. Um, so that's like an important cultural undertone, like in the history of New England. Like New England is historically a farming community, at least rural New England, and it's very difficult to do that there. Like it's rocky, lots of granite, and just extremely labor intensive, and so it required interdependence. Um, the land is hard to navigate, so you mostly stayed within your community and built your relationships locally and didn't go very far, right? That's another thing to sort of understand, especially northern New England is like very, very hilly. But there's like a couple practical examples, going back to the economy side of things, that I wanted to highlight. So there's this concept of usufruct, right? So I brought that up earlier on,
Yep.
which again is like you can essentially use land that's not yours, even profit from it in some instances, as long as you're not harming it. So there's a few things in New Hampshire that sort of are along these lines. That is actually common law. And one example is a common law in New Hampshire that you can hunt on other people's property without their permission, as long as it's not posted.
Okay.
Right. So I can go onto your land and kill a deer that in other parts of the world, that's like my deer. People would say, like, that's my
Yes.
deer without your permission, so long as you don't post your property. And historically speaking, like people did not post their property. Like that was just not a thing you did. In fact, if you did, you were considered like a total asshole, right?
Meaning this is kind of the commons when it comes to hunting.
It's like a culture of open access, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's how I grew up. Like I grew up wandering the hills of New Hampshire. I had no idea whose property I was on half of the
My
time.
understanding is that is how like the UK is
But
as well.
yes, yeah, I have
You
heard
can
that.
kind of
Yep.
just move through the landscape and like why would a deer that happened to wander on your property when 5 minutes before it was on another property is yours? It's not
Exactly.
your
Yep.
livestock. So the
Yep.
whole idea is that like these animals move through the landscape and we should be able to too, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And there's instances where you could take the concept of usufruct pretty far, but like I could go harvest down trees on my neighbor's land, and that's perfectly fine, right? From a cultural standpoint, right? Like that's totally fine. I
Interesting.
can keep their trails open, right? I can. We used to do that as kids. We keep all the snowmobile trails open after a heavy storm because snowmobiling was important to the local culture. It was important to the local economy. Like we just went and cleared the trails. Like we didn't ask for permission. We just did
Mm.
it. In some cases tap people's trees for maple syrup.
Ugh.
That's another thing that happens as well. Graze people's fields. Obviously the nice thing to do is ask permission, but that
But if
wasn't
you
something that
also could potentially have an ongoing understanding with
totally
people, like,
100%.
yeah,
Yeah,
I don't need to ask. I know that they don't care. Yeah.
yeah. There's another interesting practical example in New Hampshire called the Class 6 roads. So Class 6 roads in New Hampshire are unmaintained public roads that can, in many instances, go through people's property. And these are like historic cart paths, horse and buggy paths, like to the
Mm,
remote mountain homesteads that have been long gone for hundreds of years, right? They're basically like Jeep trails or four-wheeler trails. And in New Hampshire, those roads are called classics roads, and they're called subject to gates and bars. And that means that if you own the land on either side of them, you can bar those roads or put a gate across. You can graze cattle across, but you cannot prohibit somebody from opening that gate and closing it
Going
behind
through
them
it.
and
Okay.
traveling through your property on either side. Because technically it's town, it's a town road, though it's been not maintained and in some cases not traveled on for generations, right?
Yeah, decades. Yeah.
So just another practical example of, again, like open
Yeah.
access.
Yeah.
Um, some other interesting examples now, talking about more, I guess I would categorize this as like civics integrated with the natural world, or environmentalism, right? So you have current use, which is a designation you can put your property into. If you don't develop pieces of your property, you don't have to pay the going property tax rate for that piece of property. And it's a way of the town forfeiting potential income to encourage open spaces, essentially, right?
Okay.
So if my parents own 20 acres of farmland, and they have part of that 20 acres is a 1 acre house lot that they built a house on, they can put the 19 acres in current use, not get taxed on it at the going rate, as long as they don't build on it, they don't subdivide it, they don't, they leave it as open access for natural use.
Oh, that's
And so that's
interesting. And there's
that's a
there's
thing.
like all these conservation programs at the federal level that are basically the similar kind of thing where to pay farmers to not put their land in production, but instead toward conservation. But in this case, it's for the town and for open use of the town residents
So yeah,
potentially to pass
there's
through
actually, so
or
the current use is not for open public use. It's just an acknowledgement that the town says that it's important. I'm forfeiting my ability to get tax revenue on your property because it's important to me for you to keep that property
in
and keep it open, right? Because
yeah, got it.
otherwise, the temptation would be like, I don't want these 20 acres because I'm paying the taxes on the 20 acres, so I'm going to sell it and subdivide it,
Right.
right? So they're encouraging people to hold on to large parcels of land
Got
and
it.
keep them basically vacant. And there's another concept called a conservation easement, which is pretty easy to understand, but it's basically buying any future development rights from a landowner. The landowner still owns the land. It's just in a conservation easement, meaning like they will never be able to subdivide, never to be able to use that land for any purpose other than agricultural. So it's just another acknowledgement. And again, these decisions are made oftentimes at the town level. And
Mm,
again, I mentioned earlier, like town revenue through property tax is like the most important thing because there are no state income taxes and there are no state sales taxes. And so the town needs that money, but
yeah.
they've collectively made this decision that like we don't need the money so bad that we need to create a profit incentive for you to subdivide your land just to be able to pay your taxes or vice versa, right?
That's so yeah, that's so good.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's really crazy because just earlier today I'm recording this episode with this guy Jimmy who focuses on federal regulations and it's just basically like at the federal level it's just so hard for anyone to care about conservation. The only thing we can really do is slow development to the point that we like can look into the quote unquote look into the environmental impacts. But at this local town level, people can see it. And this was a big part of my dissertation research which was a lot of people if you're producing food in your own backyard or on your own property, you can see the effects of spraying chemicals and therefore it's at a scale at which you care and can have control over it as opposed to oh, let's set some regulations where some farmers far away from me whose operations I'm not interacting with
yeah.
regularly, so just the scale, it's just a whiplash for me having this conversation earlier and now this one where it's just sort of like at the town level, people can care about conservation and, putting parcels into conservation easements because they know that particular property and that land and they know that it's, beneficial to the whole town and
Totally,
ecosystem. Yeah. So
totally.
yeah.
So, um, so those are sort of, I summarize like a bunch of things, but those are all like the pie in the sky things. And I did want to spend like some time about talking about threats because I want to be realistic, right? I want to be
Yeah.
realistic. You mentioned earlier that I was bringing up like far left people and far right people. I was like, what are you talking about? But then I got to my notes here. So Hoppa's book,
Bookchin is far left.
Brookson's far left. Yeah,
And
yeah.
then far right, some people will say like the distributists are far right.
Well, yeah, and Hoppe is definitely far right. So he has a
Okay.
book called Democracy, the God That Failed, which basically is like a takedown of the concept of democracy. And it amounts to basically like the threat of like low information voters, coming up with a majority, and that like what's popular is not always what's best.
Mm.
Right. And so, okay, this dude's far right, but I can grant this point, right? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
what is popular is not always what's best. Like we can see that in today's society, right? There's a lot of things that are popular that are trash. So I could envision a world in which, somebody who is especially convincing, somebody who has a lot of influence or popularity, can rally a majority at the local level and make some really bad decisions, right? So I just
Mm.
want to like make that acknowledgement, like
Yeah.
that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Um,
Although I just have to say, it just seems like the scale can be a really important buffer against that because people can just physically see the results of some of these decisions in a way that they can't see
100%.
when it's like I'm making some decision about a war that's happening, in the Middle East that I have no way to even assess the information I'm getting about that war is true or not. So I would just say like the scale does buffer that a bit.
100%.
Because
Like,
even if people make a bad decision, they can see the results of it in their own backyard.
totally. And to use a practical example, in our town, in its town's history, there's only one development in town. There only has ever been one development in town, and there was space made for it, basically by regulation, by popular vote in the town, because they felt like it was a good income source, for many practical reasons, like it was popular, and so it passed. And then it got built, and it's fine. I don't want to like, it's fine, but people ultimately said we don't want that. Like, actually, that doesn't look good. That didn't come out the way we thought, and now there's no more forever allowed until maybe it becomes popular again, right?
Yeah.
So to your exact point, like, hey, maybe this sounds great. Let's try it. Try it. Ooh, that wasn't so good.
Yeah.
Close the door behind it, right? And
Yeah.
so I guess I would add to the scale thing being a buffer, also like the timeline, right? If you have recallable delegates, or if you meet annually and can adjust legislature annually, and if
You
it's
can
not
be, yeah,
5,000 page
you
bills,
can
like
be
we're
more
talking about,
agile.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're not talking about deploying a whole bunch of lawyers to write regulation. You're literally like a group of neighbors that are coming up with a 3-page document. Like,
Right.
you can fix it next year, right?
Yeah.
You can fix it next year. So great points. Another threat, to any direct democracy, and then sort of, bringing it again to a practical level, like meeting on a Tuesday,
Yeah.
when you should be at work, is, the time that it takes. Like, these town meetings used to go all day, in some
Yeah.
cases like all day, late into the night. And if you deployed all of the theory of libertarian municipalism, it would be a lot of meetings. You'd be going to a lot of meetings to make all of these different decisions, and you'd be sending your delegates, and they would be going to meetings. And so you have the Oscar Wilde quote, which is, the trouble with socialism is it requires too many evenings, right? Like, this
Well, and we all
stuff takes
know,
time.
anyone who's been around leftism at all knows, like, if you've ever been in like a group house or an intentional community, it's like the number of group meetings, house
Yeah,
meetings.
grievances and disputes and mediations. Like, it's messy. It is messy,
Yeah.
and it's
Well, and if you
draining.
think about
And
like the New Hampshire legislator, if they're all have full-time jobs too,
yeah,
it does take time.
yeah, yeah. But I think the biggest one, which is the one, frankly, I see the hardest time overcoming, at least like in applying these principles in today's society, is the mobility piece, right? And I mentioned that earlier on. Like, I don't think you can have a model with this much local autonomy when you have a highly mobile society, because then you have like a lot of unpredictability at the community level, right?
Well, and there's got to be like some percentage, and I think about this a lot with my neighborhood, some percentage where you can't go above that in terms of turnover. Otherwise,
Yeah,
the whole local culture gets upended. There's enough people in my neighborhood who grew up in this neighborhood that they can kind of like integrate newcomers and say like this is kind of what this neighborhood is about and this is the culture that we have and we don't abide certain things, whatever, but there's got to be a point at which the percentage is so high that you then lose all of that cohesion.
Yeah. Yeah, when you have a highly mobile citizen legislator base, right? Like you don't know what good looks like in your place, right? You're not around enough to know what good looks like.
Yeah.
And you don't have all the context that goes behind the legislation being proposed. You know what I mean?
Right. And like we said earlier, the human relationships where you actually care about people. Like there are certain relationships I have in this neighborhood that are 3 generations going
Yeah,
between families, where it's like I've known, we've known each other. We like our grandparents know each other. So it's just one of those things where, you have a loyalty that just is going to transcend any newcomer coming in. And it's just, no matter what happens, you're going to have a loyalty to that person.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And again, a few practical examples. So in my town, there's a lot of like summer camps and cabins and lake houses because it's a rural area and there's lots of lakes. And during COVID, of course, anybody who had a summer place from out of state, who had a summer place on a lake, like moved there during COVID, and a lot of them stayed there. And so all of a sudden,
yep.
the town population grew, and these people were coming from, not to denigrate other states, but suburban states with amenities that they were used to that they no longer had in their
They
new
just weren't
place.
used to this kind of
and
lifestyle and they didn't
and
know
they
what to
said, yeah,
expect. Yeah.
they said, I want full time, I want trash pickup at my house, and I want full time EMS and full time police officers. Like, let's propose all this legislation. They had no idea that like 80% of the town couldn't afford the tax increase that it required to pay for
It's
those
not just
things. Like,
infinite resources in
yeah,
these
yeah,
places. Yeah,
yeah,
but the expectation if you're coming from a suburb versus a city is just kind of like, well, somebody needs to pay for this.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And another practical example is like dox anybody, but there's a neighbor who has a cottage business. I won't say what it is, but like a lovely boutique cottage business that's super popular by everybody in town, and people support her and her business. Um, and then there's a faction in town who is proposing regulations that say that if you have a cottage business at your house and you're selling goods out of your house, you need to have a separate well and a separate septic for your business use. And some of the people who love this business and support this business also support this legislation, but doesn't understand that these people in this business that they love and support like could never afford those things
No,
and still
right.
continue to
That
be
would just
able to
put the business
produce.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just like this uh,
Context.
lack of context, lack of awareness, that especially if you have a highly mobile society, like you cannot have these sort of closed knit ecosystems that we're talking about in this sort of direct access, direct democracy when you don't know your neighbors, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how much more simply I could put it.
Yep. Yep.
And we live in such a highly mobile society. Like I don't know how we would even get there from here if we tried. So I don't want to like end the episode on a
No,
doom,
no, no.
but
I also just think like I'm just very curious about these different models and bringing them to different places or wherever they could be applicable. And I'm like even thinking about our neighborhood, which, like I think rural America is actually much worse off in a lot of ways than like something like my neighborhood in Chicago is it acts like a small town, but it's in a city, so we have a lot of population, so we don't have a lot of the problems of like huge amounts of churn. And I'm like curious to see how these things could apply in these different places. I'm also wondering, so we should talk about this further reading, a couple of suggestions
yeah,
of books you were suggesting to people, and then maybe we can just finish up with trying to remember some of the questions people were asking that were practical about.
mm,
It was less about these particular governance questions, but more about where how do I like find a place to call my own, and what do I do in a highly mobile society where, X, Y, and Z thing is going on? So first let's talk about further reading, and then maybe we can end with like some hopeful
Yeah,
suggestions.
the further reading is easy. Like I mentioned Murray Bookchin a few times, and I think I might have even mentioned his books. So, yeah, Ecology of Freedom, Remaking Society. There's a whole bunch. Post Scarcity Anarchy. There's a whole bunch. You'll find a lot, and a lot of them you can find for free on some anarchist website. That's easy when you can when you can Google it. A lot of it's free and out there, but stuff is interesting.
Gotta
Sometimes
hand
you
it to
get,
the anarchists. They do
yeah, yeah.
provide the content.
It's high in theory, and so sometimes you have to suffer through it. But there's good stuff there. Schumacher's "Small is Beautiful" is really good. That also was an influence that in my life between that made me go from libertarian to whatever the heck it is I am now. But basically, small local control over anything. In this case, it was economies. Right, the subtext is economics as if people mattered is important and good, and we should do that thing. And then I mentioned the Vermont Papers, which, if you're interested on the civic side, like this is the book for you. I have not found, I'm such a geek on this stuff, and I have not found an equal book to the Vermont Papers. So anybody who is interested should definitely read that. And it basically, just to give you like a tease, like it is a hypothesis or a model for like how Vermont could have a more nested, confederalist model than it already has.
Hmm.
So it's like amplifying our discussion a lot more, and it's basically like bioregionalism and nested governance. Super cool book.
And I would
So
just say
definitely check that out.
two other things. You mentioned already before, Chesterton and Belloc. They're more the Catholic side of this,
Yep.
but
Yeah,
there I don't even.
Chesterton's "What's Wrong with the World," I think is one of the books I've read. That's, I think, one of his more popular ones. There's a few others.
And they get at these same concepts through
Yes,
it's more like a Catholic lens. I don't.
yes.
Some people think you can't be distributist and not make it a Catholic thing. I'm not convinced of that, but I also would say one hopeful note is I do think like we're basically deglobalizing,
Mm,
and continuing in the path of, you know, in human history, in the big scheme of things, we more or less worked on certain human scales. There's all sorts of different examples throughout history, like even this David Graeber book that came out with the Native Americans. They're like, they're tribes, and then they trade, once a year, this kind of thing. City states, and it was only really in the modern era that we've got these like large nation states, and then now like that are trading globally and interdependent globally. A lot of people think we're just scaling down from that, and
mm,
we're already in the process of it. So I think it's, if doomer optimism is thinking about like prefiguring maybe what's to come, it's good to know about these models and to be thinking about them, and maybe even experimenting with them to the extent possible, if it is the case, or even if it's not, because the models are good anyways. But even if
sure.
but if it is the case that we're like scaling down, and deglobalizing, and the extent to which we can put more power and more engagement in as local as possible, I think is just like kind of basically good. I don't really see a downside of it at
Totally.
the scale that we're at now. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure anybody who's ever been like in a crisis zone, in Appalachia with all of the hurricane flooding and stuff,
yeah,
like when systems break down, like you need methods of community
this,
organizing. Like reading these books would be good preps, right? I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like
yeah,
there will be a need to rally around your neighbors and have decision making at a smaller scale, and so familiarize yourself with these concepts. But you can put them in practice, like create a neighborhood association. Where I live, there's all these neighborhood associations across the area, without doxing myself, and like there's not a lot of power there, but there's a lot of conviviality and there's advocacy to their local city council people. And so practice it, like create a neighborhood association, like
Yeah.
talk about what that even means. Like, what are your initiatives as a neighborhood association? And practice it, right? But most importantly, like get out and talk to your neighbors, which I think
Yeah,
gets
and
us
to
to the
me,
last piece.
yeah, so I would just say like one thing that I've been railing on against more and more lately is just like utopianism broadly, which is just
Hmm.
like things should be this way in this sort of like top down. I've been talking about this on the podcast forever, but like most of this stuff is literally just like an art and a practice more than anything else. It's getting out there, like actually figuring out the kinds of things, your neighbors and your community cares about, engaging with them about it, seeing what the levers of power are. Like it's just a literal ongoing practice of life to be engaged civically. So it's cool that these, models exist and people worked out ways to do this well. So bringing those into our lives, it's just a practice. It's just like,
Hmm.
something you learn by doing, I would say. Okay, final thoughts. I remember there was just like so much engagement at the Margaretville retreat, asking you specific questions about like, what do I do? Where do I live? I don't know
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
remember the tenor of a lot of those questions. People wanted to talk about that for like an hour, and we did not have the time.
Yeah, there were so many people who, in essence, like came up to me and said the same thing, which is like, what you talk about sounds so awesome, but I don't come from a place that sounds anything like the place that you came from. Like my family was transient, or like all my siblings are spread across the country, or I haven't felt like that place that feels like home. Like, what do I do to even find a place to set down roots? Um, and so
What
there
do
were several people that came up and essentially said that same thing, which like my heart breaks for them because like I don't know what that feels like. I have a hard time like empathizing with that, and I consider myself like super lucky. Like to me, home, like in homeland, means like a very specific thing, like crystal clear in my mind. Um, so I didn't have a lot to offer them, but you know, I think you're in your own case, like I think you probably have like maybe more advice to offer than I can, and you have an experience of like leaving and returning and like making a conscious decision to do that. From what I understand, like revolving around like basically being with your family, like regardless of whether that place was perfect or not, like it's where you are from and it's where your family is. And so, from a logistics standpoint, if nothing else, like that makes
hope
sense
your
for you,
family is?
for you to
Well,
be where you need to be.
yeah, and I
Yeah.
I would just say like, I mean, everybody comes from somewhere. It might be that your suburban upbringing didn't have a lot of like conviviality or civic culture, but I would just say like to the extent possible, there's this whole narrative, and it's like your whole poem is about this, that you should go away.
Hmm.
If you have any ambitions, you need to go away. And I just think like what I've come around to is there is pretty much nothing more valuable in like a, even from like, this sounds so like grotesque and sociological, but like from like a human resource perspective, or like, where a human capital, people say, of having relationships with people through time. There is nothing like there, these relationships, you were saying this transience, like when people first come in, like, you're just getting to know each other, but the getting to know each other process is so long, like
Hmm.
where you can actually build a reputation and a sense of a true understanding of one another. And so one thing Pat and I didn't really realize, because we were so, I think, caught up in like the narratives, the sort of utopian narratives of like global collapse or collapse of civilizations, or like you don't want to be in the center of your civilization. I mean, we kind of told ourselves the story. You don't want to be in a Jew in Europe in World War
Hmm.
II. Like,
Hmm.
get
Hmm.
out of there.
Hmm. Yeah.
But and like to some extent, there's some truth to that. It's just at a way tinier scale. But on the other hand, like there is nothing more, I think, valuable in this world than relationships through time. And so you
Hmm.
have these families, or these, and not just to people, but to a place. I
Hmm.
know these institutions. I went to Macaulay. I know Marist. I know St. Cajetan, I know St. Barnabas, I know what these institutions have been like my entire life for 40 years. I know what they represent. I know the culture inherent in them. So I can like, there's a kind of power I have in that. You know what I
Mm,
mean? It's like a power. It's almost like you say you don't want to do much politically where you live now. I felt the same way in Uruguay. Like, I don't, I don't know enough to say here. I
mm,
shouldn't. I don't even feel like I'm justified in having a say over what happens here. Whereas in my neighborhood now, I'm just like, I know exactly what this institution is, and I am happy to give an
sure.
opinion. You know what I mean? It's like these, local parish kids have always been little assholes, and their principal needs to address it. Not all of them. One, little subset of the culture where the kids are always like, vandalizing things. And it's like I can walk right into that parish and have the confidence that know what I'm talking about. So I don't know. I just think like the extent to which you can see those things as real resources as opposed to your ambition and like your employment potential in
Mm,
like a big
mm.
city or whatever, and everybody goes to like New York, or people from Milwaukee go to Chicago, and everybody goes to their like sucked up into their local big city, and then never to be seen again. They're rootless cosmopolitan now. And I just think like your power is in these in like long-term connections. Whether you can have to start fresh or whether you have to go, I think of Andy Coutura, like Coutura has this huge family. Go somewhere with a few members of the family and set
Mhm,
down roots as like a group there. There's a
mhm,
power in that. Like whatever
mhm.
you can do to like ramp up those connections and continue them from your childhood on, that's what I would suggest people do.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think to summarize, right, like best case scenario, in my opinion, like don't leave, right? Stay. Second best case is like go home, right? If you have a home to return to, and if you don't have a return to, like the third best thing is like stop moving, like stay put. How
Pick some place you're
for
actually going to commit to. I mean, it's like
yeah.
marriage in some extent. Like, you could keep. I remember talking to somebody who was on like their fourth husband, and she was like, I talked to my mom about this, and she was like, I should have just stuck with the first bullshit
Yeah,
husband.
that's like the
Because they're
perfect
all going to be
analogy.
a
The
little
perfect
bit
analogy.
bullshit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like you
yeah,
got to just stick with a place. You have to commit. Make
yeah.
a vow. I'm here. I'm with this place. And with people too, like people in place. The extent to which you can like sort of just commit and stay put. I think there's something so powerful in that everybody underestimates.
Totally. I totally agree. It's a great analogy. And I think I just want to acknowledge, like, probably like outlining these priorities or opinions from my standpoint to like the strivers. Like, I'm talking to the strivers, right?
Yeah.
Obviously there's extenuating circumstances, but like the people who are after like the next best thing, and certainly people who are chasing, financial capital at the risk of or at the loss of social capital. Like, man,
Yeah.
you are making the wrong decisions, like the wrong decisions.
Yeah. Totally.
So seek out social capital, like stop moving. The extent that like, you really are looking for the next best place. Like there's a lot of practical suggestions I would make. And that's why I love like Andy. Andy's very provocative, like in the practical sense, like find a house that's under $50,000 and like get a job as a mailman. And like, that's awesome. Like, cool. Yeah. That
Yeah.
actually is cool. I love that. Speaking again, maybe to the strivers of like my own class, like, look at rural places, like look at rural New England. Like there's amazing mill towns that need your help all across New England that are not as cheap as Andy would like, but are cheaper certainly than the Cambridges or whatever of the world. If you can work from home, like all the better. Like if you can take outside capital working some great middle class job and spend that money locally and engage yourself locally and not have a commute and can engage in the community right after work after you walk out your front door, like that's pretty awesome. That seems pretty magical. These places are beautiful. They've got great infrastructure. Like
Yep.
I said, they need your capital. Like, so if you're looking for your next best place to settle down because you don't have a home, like that's my pitch to New Hampshire. It's got the town meeting, like we talked about. It's got
Yeah,
the
yeah, totally. And
high
especially
level
if
of
you can like
representation.
connect. I know people like I know a lot of people say like stay with like-minded friends, but I would say like move with some siblings or cousins or something
Totally.
who like
That's
you
another
both
thing you
are
do.
like,
Yep.
this suburb, I don't want to live here anymore. Like I'm not connected or whatever. Or we both moved to New York and LA and we're looking for some place to settle now that we have kids. It always happens when you have a family. You're like, looking for that continuity for your own kids. Go settle someplace. If you, it's part of the American spirit to settle someplace new, but then stay put there, commit to it, and the more social capital you have, the better. With these things. Any final words, comments before we wrap up?
Not really. I hope my ramblings were coherent enough to make it
Yeah,
valuable.
totally. This is so good. It's such a nice like definitional, you know, podcast where we're just sort of describing these things that totally exist, and that we can learn from. My whole shtick lately is just we need to stop being so utopian, and we need to rescue and or bring forth older forms of institutions that we know worked, and so I think it's really cool and inspirational to talk about institutions that we know worked, for what reason, what did they feel like, and how to reinvigorate them.
Yeah,
So
and stop. I guess like stop forfeiting your agency or like delegating them to a proxy. Like take autonomy whenever and wherever you can get it. And there's a lot more that you can get than you think. I think it is, is the point. Like maybe do some things without asking permission. Maybe
yeah,
fix that sidewalk outside your home without like calling the city bureaucrat to like come and do it and wait months. Like
yeah,
just get your neighbors together and buy a few stacks of Quikrete and like fix the sidewalk or the pothole or
I
put
love
up a
that.
stop sign or some speed strips. I'm maybe giving you some hints to some things that are going on in my head, but like you have agency. You can create your own agency in some senses. So stop buying in, especially to like this federal politics. Like vote once every 4 years, and like you invest all this time and energy, and like those people are not representing you. They're not representing your neighbors. Especially, don't look at your neighbors as proxies of those people, just because they have
God,
like the
no.
Harris Waltz or the Trump sign in their front yard. Like
Yep.
get to know your neighbors as actual people, like the types of families they come from, how they walk in the communities that they live in, and let all that other shit slide. I think
I
is
love it. Oh my gosh, this is a great note to end on. I'm saying in my head, don't say his real name, don't say his real name. Wally, thanks for coming on. This is so great. You gotta come on more regularly. You gotta get back on Twitter, man.
I know I'm reluctantly thinking about it. I don't know.
All right, I gotta run. Kids are
Cool,
home, but this is so fun.
awesome,
All right,
cool.
talk to you. Bye.
Thanks. We'll see you.